The year was 1969, a time of cultural upheaval. Yet for one girl and a quiet town, it was the year that her life would come to an abrupt, tragic end. The world at this time was changing, but for her family, the Foiles family, the world stopped the moment they realized she had been the victim of a heinous crime, one that now has gone unsolved for over 5 decades. In March of last year, I covered the disappearance case of Gayla Shaper, a 28-year-old woman who vanished while feeding her horses on June 29th of 1979 in Moscow, Lada County, Idaho. When I was researching for that case, I came across another case from that area, a girl who, unlike Gayla, was found soon after she vanished. It was the manner in which she was found, though, that left this college town shaken to its core. As time passed, though, the answers in this case grew more elusive, the trail colder, but her story has never been forgotten by those who love her. Although many of those individuals are sadly not here today. 55 years later, this tragic unsolved case we're covering today is discussed sporadically by the local news in Moscow, journalists who passionately cover cold cases and decide to talk about it, and sometimes even podcasters who have stumbled upon it in a similar manner that I had. This is the case of Janice Foiles. Born on the crisp fall day of September 18th, 1951, in the heart of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, Janice Lynn Foiles was a child of promise and beauty. Her parents, Marvin and Karma, joyfully welcomed their baby girl into the world and from there made sure her formative years were spent in a loving and supportive environment. Janice grew up with 4 brothers, Randall, Leslie, Stanley, and Stephen, and one sister named Anne. The Foiles family lived in Coeur d'Alene until they moved to Boise, where Janice attended Boise High School for freshman and sophomore year. After another move, this time to Moscow, Janice found herself the new girl once again, eventually graduating from Moscow High School in 1969 after attending the school for her junior and senior year. In high school, she was credited for her involvement in the school's French and pep clubs, as well as being an active member in American Field Service, the school's foreign exchange program. She was also very passionate about her religion. She was a member of the Presbyterian Church in Boise. Based on my research, Gayla Shaper attended Moscow High School from the years of 1965 to 1969, meaning both Gayla and Janice attended the same high school at the same time, and due to the fact they were born about 3.5 months apart, I would assume they were a part of the same graduating class. Gayla, though, would vanish 10 years after Janice's murder. After high school, Janice enrolled at the University of Idaho taking business classes. This college may sound familiar due to the fact that it hit national headlines back in the year of 2022. As the case goes, during the very early morning hours of Sunday, November 13th of 2022, Ethan Chapin, Madison Mogan, Kaylee Gonsalves, and Xana Kernodle were brutally murdered in their off-campus residence. Brian Koberger, a PhD student at Washington State University, has been charged with the murders and a trial currently awaits. These 4 bright young students were devastatingly stabbed to death. My heart goes out to their families, and I do have my fingers crossed for this trial that is currently set for August 11th of this year. Back to 1969, though, Janice was 18 years old, a freshman at the time. She had her entire life ahead of her, just like the 4 students who would attend her same college decades later. She was described by the ones who knew her best as being a sweetheart, quiet, and as kind as she was beautiful. Janice's life at this time was very similar to a lot of college students' life, even today. She spent time with her friends, her family, she attended her classes, tried to make good grades, and she was saving up money by working a part-time job. Janice worked as a waitress at a cafe called Tip Top Cafe that was located on what was considered the outskirts of the Moscow business district. She had been working there for about 2 years at this time, and it was a job she thoroughly enjoyed working. She liked to keep busy, take orders, and talk to locals, and also knew people who stopped in. She possessed a captivating personality that really made people feel welcome. Today at that location of 227 East 3rd Street sits a lock shop called the Lock Shop of North Idaho, Inc. On the other side of the divided wall, later put in, was HQ Hair Salon, but it's currently permanently closed. The date in discussion, though, is Sunday, December 28th of 1969, only 3 days after Christmas. It was like any other day, with Janice heading to the Tip Top Cafe to work the final shift of that day. She was expected to close up the cafe, and her family was expecting her home right after. Janice hadn't mentioned any other plans to anyone in her family. It was assumed that she was going to finish work and then head directly home. It was a Sunday after all, so it would have been a slow day at the cafe anyway, considering what day of the week it was, but it would have been especially slow considering it was only a few days after Christmas and so many students in the area were back home for the holidays, or they were at home locally spending time with their family and preparing for New Year's. Janice would have been closing that night alone, anywhere between 7 to 9 p.m. It all depended on how many people would have been coming in and how busy it was. Her family knew, though, that she wouldn't have been held up there serving customers later than 9 p.m. A few hours passed, and her family grew worried when she hadn't arrived back home. They were thinking, had she gone to a friend's house? Had she decided to drive around for a bit, make a stop somewhere, and was taking longer than she intended to? When midnight passed, though, they knew that something was wrong. They just felt it in their gut. They didn't want to think the worst and hoped that she would walk through the door any moment and have an explanation, but more time passed and they decided it was time to head out and look for her. Janice's brother, Randall, and her father made their way to the Tip Top Cafe, and they walked into a scene that no loved one should ever have to witness. I don't think that anyone should ever have to view something so soul-crushing as this in general, but especially not a family member or a friend. They arrived at the cafe at about 3:50 a.m. during the very early morning hours of Monday, December 29th, and the first thing that they noticed was that the main door had been locked. Her brother and father walked into the cafe by entering an unlocked door and found Janice's bludgeoned, lifeless body lying behind the counter. This is the exact moment that changed the trajectory of life for the Foiles family forever. As Janice's sister Anne told KHQ News in 2018, you don't really forget the wailing from your parents. The Moscow Police Department took over the case from there. Authorities believe that Janice most likely had locked the front door at the end of her shift and then let the culprit inside, keeping the front door locked so no more customers came in behind them. That, or the culprit entered through another door, the same unlocked door her brother and father would enter through because they entered through an unlocked door. And I'm going to assume that this was either on the side of the building or in the back of the building. From all of my research, it seems like authorities and her family more so lean towards the first theory, that whoever was responsible for this was somebody that Janice willingly let into the building. The reason for that is because they do view this as a crime of passion, that maybe it was someone she knew, maybe it was someone that she trusted and would have been willing to let inside of the restaurant as she was closing up. An autopsy was conducted that Monday afternoon, and the medical examiner concluded that Janice had died as a result of massive head injuries from multiple blows by a jagged instrument. This weapon of choice was not found at the crime scene and has never been located still to this day, but it is believed to have been a claw hammer. The blows, one in particular, possessed enough force that it left a hole in her skull. Police Captain Robert Means stated that she had been fatally beaten sometime a little before or after 9 p.m. on Sunday night. According to the Kellogg Evening News, they believe this was the time because a Moscow police officer had actually been making his rounds Sunday night and passed by the cafe a little before 9. He stated that the lights were still on. He parked his police car, jiggled the handle, it was locked, and he looked through the window, and Janice seemed to be counting the till out. After that, he stated that he left. He didn't think that she had heard him trying to get inside and figured that she was simply just closing up and that everything was okay, and he continued on with making his rounds. Captain Means stated that it was unclear what the motive was, why someone would have done this to her, considering there were no signs of sexual assault present, and she had been found with the day's receipt in her hand, which totaled to $17, which is a little less than $150 today. Nothing had been stolen off of Janice herself or from the cafe, so they ruled out robbery and sexual assault as the motive. Her family was obviously in complete and utter shock, but they tried to help authorities in any way that they could to track down who could have done this to Janice. The problem was that a crime this violent, it had to have been, or else they believe and still believe today, it was a crime of passion. It was someone who knew her. It really seems that most everyone believed it had to have been done by someone who held strong emotions towards Janice, someone who disliked her greatly, or possibly a past lover. Janice didn't have any known enemies, though. She was well liked, and any past love interests or anyone who had possibly been interested in her at the time romantically were extensively questioned and all checked out. Moscow in 1969 was still very much a town with a foundation in agriculture and local business. It was not a place familiar with violent homicides. We have to remember that this was a time before DNA testing, so that was not an option, but authorities took what evidence they could from the crime scene. Her remains were examined to the best of the medical examiner's ability, and she was eventually laid to rest in Moscow Cemetery following her funeral service held on January 2nd of 1970. As Janice lay under the earth, authorities persisted in spreading the word of her case while a community hoped an arrest would soon be made. After weeks had passed and they were not obtaining any new evidence, no promising leads were really coming into the department, they figured that the next step in this case was to, at least after everything she had been through and the way her life had ended, give her a proper burial. Her father would tell a local newspaper roughly 2 months after her murder that she was really beginning to come out of her shell and have fun in life at the time that her life was taken. When it comes to the investigation, Moscow police would question hundreds of people in relation to this case, but none of these interviews led them closer to solving her murder, even if at certain times they truly believed they were zeroing in on a solid suspect. Former Moscow police chief Dan Weaver told the Lewiston Tribune in 2014 that people were even regularly bringing in claw hammers to the department. They checked them all, but none were believed to be the missing murder weapon. Also, no one was coming forward claiming they had seen anything suspicious the night that she was killed. There had been blood splattered in the cafe near her remains. Chances are that her killer would have had blood on him as well. I couldn't find any information as to whether anyone stated they saw anyone in the area that night covered in blood, in possession of a bloody hammer, or even anyone in that area around that time that looked suspicious. It really seems, based on my research, there were no eyewitnesses who believed that they saw the man who took her life that night that it happened. Former Moscow Police Sergeant Dave Williams, who worked the case later on, would say that they believe this case was an isolated incident, that it wasn't just the work of some psychopath. By this, I'm going to assume that he means that this wasn't done by someone who was just going around doing something like this on the regular, that it wasn't the work of a serial killer, that it was done by someone who had their eyes on Janice. The crime was directed toward her, that it wasn't one of those situations where she was simply at the wrong place at the wrong time. The strange thing, though, is that if someone targeted her, if they had planned this out, planned to take her life, wouldn't you think they would have brought the murder weapon, whatever they decided to take her life with them? Well, it was discovered that the Tip Top Cafe kept a claw hammer behind the counter at all time. This claw hammer had one claw missing the last time it was seen, and after the murder, it was gone from its usual spot. Investigators believe that it is too coincidental that a claw hammer had been kept behind the counter in a toolbox. One is believed to be the murder weapon, and the one behind the counter has never been found. It is believed that that restaurant hammer was the instrument used to kill her. Whatever happened to this claw hammer is completely unknown still today. This claw hammer is most likely still out there somewhere, possibly still in Moscow. Now, although this case was highly publicized locally at the time, it was what everyone was talking about for many months afterward. Tips were coming into the department less and less until leads nearly dried up completely. The wait was agonizing for her family, like it is for any family enduring something like this, but they hoped for a resolution and they hoped for it soon, that her killer would be located and he would be brought to justice. The Moscow Police Department, Idaho State Police, and the FBI had exhausted all their leads, though, within only a few months. The next real update in this case came 2 years later. On Friday, March 3rd of 1972, the body of 17-year-old Moscow High School junior Crystal George was found in a field a little north of the area 44 hours after she vanished from leaving her part-time job at the Moscow Daily Idahonian. The Tri-City Herald reported that she had been stabbed twice and shot 7 times by a gun in the .30 caliber range. At first, authorities believed that Crystal and Janice's murders may have been connected. Both were reserved, kind-hearted girls who didn't have a list of people who would have been possibly out for them. Crystal's case, though, would be solved relatively quick, and it doesn't seem like it had any connection to Janice's. On April 13th of that same year, 19-year-old Everett Bowers was arrested for the murder of Crystal George. He had previously attended the same high school as Crystal and was also a co-worker of hers at the newspaper. Both worked in the circulation department. He did fully confess to taking her life and entered a guilty plea. In his confession, he stated he offered Crystal a ride home, and as they were leaving work on the night of March 1st, his car developed a flat tire. He stated that she located his .38 caliber pistol in his car. He struggled to get the gun away from her. The gun went off. She was shot in her stomach, and he said he decided to end her life and shoot her 6 more times and stab her twice, eventually dumping her body in the field where it would be located 2 days later. Bowers actually helped in the search for Crystal during the period of time when she was missing. On May 1st of that year, he was given life in prison. They did not find any connection between Crystal's murder and Janice's, though. They are believed to be done by 2 separate individuals, that there's no connection there. Crystal's case was solved, though, and this gave hope to those who were so desperately wanting Janice's case to be solved as well. Janice's case, though, is really one of those cases where throughout the last 55 years since it occurred, the main time it resurfaces in the public eye is when there's someone new at the Moscow Police Department and eventually gets to the point of looking into cold cases at the department and decides to take another look at it and talk about it with local papers or on the news. The first time that this happened was 11 years after her murder. Gail Pete Peterson took over as police chief at the Moscow Police Department in 1981 and started really looking over her case a month after he arrived. He told the Kellogg Evening News on January 13th of 1983, "We don't work the case all the time. It's not top priority. But we've brought out all the old case files and we've explored new leads that have popped up." He went on to say, "Our chances of finding the killer are as good as they were 13 years ago. They didn't solve it then, so the chances can't be worse." Janice's father was quoted during the same article saying, "I don't know what the police can do after all this time, but I wish them luck. Everybody who knew her liked her, but not that many people knew her. She hadn't been here long enough to make many close friends, but at the same time, she didn't have an enemy in the world." When it comes to a possible motive or finding her killer, her father went on to say, "I used to sit and think about it, and I could never come up with a reason. That used to bother me, but it doesn't anymore. It's been 13 years, and I guess I'm a little afraid of knowing." At this point, even 13 years after the murder, her family wasn't extremely optimistic there was going to be a huge update soon, especially that huge update being catching her killer after over a decade. The next update in this case was another decade after this, which was 1993. As the Times News reported, on Christmas Day of 1993, Moscow Police Lieutenant Jacob Philip Kersiznik was only 12 when Janice's murder happened, but he believed that he knew who took her life. He had put out an article in the Daily News the year prior in an attempt to scare their person of interest, a man living in Montana in 1993 who has never been named publicly. He told the paper that back in October of the previous year, he and then Leda County prosecutor Craig Mossman interviewed the potential suspect in person. He said they didn't get a confession, but he deemed the trip productive. During that same month, Krzyznik gained permission from the Foiles family to exhume Janice's casket. They did and were able to obtain more clues. The main clue being a Bible that had been placed in her casket while it was open during her funeral. Authorities heard that this man who was lying under suspicion had slipped a Bible into her casket during her funeral, and this fueled them to look into him even more, and they wanted to get that Bible from her casket, so they ultimately had to exhume the casket. Information regarding this person of interest in the early 90s is very limited. I wish I did have more information to give you all, but I do believe that things were kept very hush-hush because they did not want to potentially sabotage the outcome of this case. Krzyznik believed wholeheartedly that the person who put the Bible in her casket during her funeral was the person responsible for her murder. Who this person is, obviously of some sort of closeness to Janice, has never been released to the public. They took the Bible from inside the casket, sent it to the FBI for handwriting and possible fingerprint analysis. I'm guessing there was some writing inside of the Bible, maybe the name of who it had belonged to in the front of the Bible. Krzyznik stated that that revelation and all the circumstantial evidence they had pointed to this man in Montana. I'm going to assume that there is far more circumstantial evidence when it comes to this man, but they've just never released it to the public. At this time, this unknown man is really who they had their eyes on. They really believed that this was their man. They were even asking the public again for people to search their homes and properties for the missing claw hammer. They thought that if they could locate this claw hammer, they would possibly be able to connect it to this man and connect it to the murder, and they would be able to solve Janice Foiles' case. They believed that possibly the culprit hid it somewhere locally after the murder. It seems that the claw of the claw hammer, like I said before, was missing, but also they said that possibly this hammer's handle had been wrapped in a brown material believed to be leather. So at this time, they were telling everybody, even though it was so many years later, to just be on the lookout for this claw hammer. In the end, though, this lead, with little details released publicly regarding it, never went anywhere. Like I said, authorities have been a bit tight-lipped about this lead that they followed during the early 1990s, but it seems that Krzyznik believed that this really was the guy who took Janice Foiles' life. It may be one of those unfortunate circumstances where they just didn't have the solid, tangible evidence to tie him to the murder, but there was a lot of circumstantial. It just wasn't enough to charge him with the crime. Because of this, her case remained cold. People would come and go at the department for decades, some more hopeful than others that they would be the one to uncover the truth of who killed Janice Foiles on that fateful night back in 1969. Her family was interviewed in the year of 2008, and at that point, her father said that he didn't think more would come of the case, and her mother said that the family has tried to move on the best that they can. A lengthy article was released by the Lewiston Tribune covering Janice's case on May 19th of 2014. It covered a lot of the information I've presented already in this video, but also discussed ways her case affected the community. How many people all these years later still talk about Janice, still wonder what happened to her and who was responsible, and if her killer is still out there living free today. Gary Crabtree, the owner of the Lock Shop, which is the shop that took over in the building where the Tip Top Cafe used to be, stated that its previous owner, Jeff Beckett, was the one who told him everything he came to know about the case. Tony Latham, the woman who owned the salon that's no longer there today, stated that some of her more elderly clients would come in and they would mention the case. So even all these years later, so many decades have passed and people still remember what happened that night. Lieutenant Dave Lemitz did state in the Lewiston Tribune that there were a lot of details about the crime scene itself that they never released publicly, because if someone ever did come forward with a full confession, they wanted to see if that person really did have information only the killer, her family, or authorities would know, which is, of course, a smart move, and it's done often in cases, which is definitely something to remember when you listen to these cases. If you are somebody who listens to a lot of true crime cases and you're just freaking out because you want to know certain details or information, or you wonder why this or this or this happened, or why authorities came to a conclusion about something because there's not a lot of information to back that up. Usually there is so much more information, but they're very strategic about what they let the public know. So as frustrating as it may be, being somebody who is extremely interested or passionate about a certain case, and you just kind of want to be an armchair detective and see if you can piece together something yourself, because there are some people who do, from the comfort of their home, solve cases. There is a reason why some information is kept private. Back to Janice's case, though. The next update in her case was in the year of 2018 when KHQ Local News did a segment on Janice and Gayla's cases, where they sat down with Janice's sister, Anne.
I think that it would be healthy for everyone, including him, to have that closure and forgiveness and explanation.
With cases this old, it really is heartbreaking knowing that so many people have passed away never knowing what happened. Janice's father passed away in 1983 at the age of 60. Her mother passed away in 2017 at the age of 95. And Janice's brother Stephen unfortunately passed away in 2013 at the age of 49 from gallbladder cancer. The ones still here, although they found ways to heal and cope in their own way, which is all anyone really can do after trauma and loss, still they want closure. They want a conclusion. They deserve that. And so does Janice. She deserves for there to be justice served in her case. I do have to mention, though, that to keep Janice's memory alive, her family did actually start a scholarship at the University of Idaho in her name, and I just find that so incredible. From my research, it seems that authorities did exhume her remains again, and they did try to locate DNA from her killer on what remained of her, but were unable to locate anyone else's DNA. If you have any information regarding the case of Janice Foiles, you are urged to contact the Moscow Police Department at 208-882-COPS, which is 208-882-2677, or Idaho Cold Case Tips at 844-TIP-4040, which is 844-847-4040. With cases like this that happened so long ago, there's no DNA evidence to test to try to find her killer. They really are hoping that there will possibly be some sort of deathbed confession. Some people, as they're nearing the end of their life, they will genuinely start to feel even just a little bit of remorse for the things that they did in their life that negatively affected others. But there are some people, and this is honestly a lot of them, that will know their time is up very soon. And it's not because they feel bad about what they did. It's because they are terrified about what comes after. They believe that confessing may earn them some sort of brownie points with whatever God that they do believe in, and if they do believe in hell, that it may possibly exclude them from burning in it for eternity. As rare as deathbed confessions are, it's not something that happens every single day. They do happen in cases, and they have been known to solve them. I do also want to say that with this case, if you do dive into it online, there are a lot of people locally to Moscow, a lot of these people that grew up in the area around the time that this case took place, and they do have a lot to say about some people locally. And one of those people is somebody that people believe may truly have been the person who took her life, and that is the person that was heavily looked into in the early 90s. Due to the fact that authorities and her family have never talked in great detail about this person and also some of the other theories that are floated around online, I do not personally feel comfortable discussing them in today's video. I am very cautious when it comes to the theories that I bring up in my videos and I decide to discuss, because I never want to obviously jeopardize a case. I never want to point fingers at somebody who may have had zero involvement whatsoever. And I never want to hurt any of the family members emotionally. I feel like the only time on my channel where I feel like I present a lot of different theories, anything that I can find online that may be something to even bring up, is when I discuss Jane and John Doe cases, because I feel like in those cases, we don't know who they are, and any little bit of information, it could be anything at all, could be what ends up identifying them. But even in those instances, you have to cite your sources and you have to be respectful. But that is all of the information that I have for you all today regarding the case of Janice Foiles. I've wanted to cover Janice's case since I covered Gayla's case last year. I do not think that I could have done this video and collected as much research as I did without newspapers.com, because there's so little about her case online. I want to thank you all, though, for taking a little bit of time out of your day to hear about Janice's case. And like always, you never know who may stumble upon this video, so make sure to leave some kind comments down below for the loved ones of Janice Foiles. If there are any other cases that you possibly want me to cover here on my channel, make sure to send those requests over to gabulosiscaserequests@gmail.com. I hope you all have an amazing rest of your day. Stay safe, and I will hopefully see you in the next one.